The more evidence, the better, I say.
I mean, this is so improbable.
That's a bold statement.
I mean, I think that's a fair point, but I didn't make that argument. He did.
Why is that true? Is that a good question? Maybe it's not.
Drew, you're not supposed to ask good questions like
sorry,
that.
sorry.
Don't ask difficult questions.
Bill, jump in here.
I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic.
You're listening to The Divide.
Okay, welcome back to The Divide. I'm Drew the Skeptic, and I'm here with Bill the Christian, and we're going to have part 3 of our cross-examination, for lack of a better word, of each other. In the first couple, we talked about sort of our subjective ways of seeing the world. Bill talked about how when he looks at the world, he sees awe, or he is in awe, and it harkens him to a where did this all come from, and to a creator. And my sort of subjective reality was that of having to sort of figure things out for myself, self-reliant. I couldn't really come up with a great term like awe, but the idea of not being able to assume or believe based on just something that's not firsthand. That's how I explained it, and you can go back and listen to those 2 episodes if you want to hear us flesh those out. But for our next portion of this, we thought we'd look at some more objective factors for us, and so I'm just going to start us off today by asking Bill the question: what is one, or what are some of the objective ways that or facts that you see that shape your view?
Yeah, so I was thinking about how, when I talked about awe and the direct impression, which I use as an analogy, seeing Michelangelo's David for the first time, and how I was in awe of that, of him. Even I think if I had not known who he was, I still would have been in awe of him. So that was sort of my analogy. But direct impressions are obviously highly intuitive and can certainly lead you astray. So it seems like for someone like me who believes in God that I need something in addition to that, or at least I naturally seek it. That's a little more objective than just my sort of intuition. And
some evidence.
So I think, some evidence, exactly. And so I think the way I would look at this is, first of all, I'm sure I would give different answers to this at different stages of my life. So I didn't become a Christian until I was. I believed in God anyway till I was, around 20 for the first time. And so it really, I think my answer now, it's not like I'm claiming, this is the answer a Christian like myself should have. But and the other thing I would say is, when I look at the evidence, one thing that's really important to me is that I have some awareness of the way people that are outside of my tradition have looked at this evidence. And do they come to some of the same conclusions I do, or are Christians on an island unto themselves? So that's another big factor, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So these I'm going to cite 3 or 4 things, and I think of them as sort of stairs, in the sense that the first couple are more generic and more general, and I think if you get up those stairs, the other ones become more relevant, whereas they become less relevant if you don't even get up onto those stairs. So the first one would just be that, to me, the universe seems fundamentally ordered. There is order at sort of the bottom level of the universe, and in fact, I don't even think you can really do science unless you believe that. I think it's Hume, who famously was a skeptic and says essentially the scientific conclusions themselves are unreliable if the universe doesn't have some fundamental order to it. So, and again, when I look at the world and ask myself, is it a cosmos? The Greeks called it a cosmos because that meant ordered and beautiful, which is why we have the term cosmetics and the word cosmos, both from the same root. But so when the Greeks and the Romans looked at the universe, they also saw it as ordered. It's not as though I'm alone or Christians are alone, or monotheists are alone in seeing that there appears to be a fundamental order to the universe. And closely with that is our concepts of purpose. But I won't push that too hard. But I think that that's pretty tightly related. If you ask people, does it seem like we were intended to be here, or is it all just an accident? Probably most people seem to have the impression that there's a feeling of purpose that goes along with the order. Anyway,
okay.
So the first level is
so before
the first
you go
stair
on
is
to
order.
your next stair or level, let me just clarify that you're basically, the opposite of order is chaos, right? So this is just, this is sort of a concept that I think most of us would agree with, just that we're not in a world that we can't make any sense out of. Is that what you're driving at?
Yeah, that's what I should have just said that and moved on.
No, I like the explanation. It makes sense.
So I will say, obviously there's some people who don't think that, who think the world is sort of fundamentally chaotic. The ancient, not to go too hard into philosophers or anything, but Democritus and his atomic theory in the ancient world was fundamentally chaotic. It assumed a certain randomness, but there were hardly any people, even among the philosophers and stuff, that thought that, who agreed with him. Most of them would have seen a fundamental order, and certainly the average person did. So that's step one. And then step two, the next stair up in my direction is that there is an immaterial layer of reality that is part of the universe. It's not, in other words, I'm not a materialist. So, and I don't think of that as just sort of like a subjective opinion. I think of it as something that's evidential or evidentiary. It's observed in some deep, obvious way. So my example of things like this would be mathematics, logic, morality, consciousns, and I think of all this as sort of it's part of this, that of the universe not being able to be explained solely on materialistic grounds. And again, I check my conclusion about this against the non-Christian or non-monotheistic traditions, like not just Greek philosophers, but the way Egyptians and people like this often looked at the world. So and how did they look at it? Well, they also saw it. The vast majority of them saw it as a that there's an immaterial layer of reality that is part and parcel with the world as we know it.
The word immaterial, as and opposed to just material, you're not smuggling in the supernatural here, right? You're just talking about
correct
math, logic, realities that that most of us, I should say, kind of agree exist, but they're not tangible things we can touch or feel.
Yeah, they're not. They're. If you use the term supernatural, I would say, well, they're supernatural in the original meaning of the word. They're supra natura or whatever. They're sort of above a physical natural world in that sense, but they're not outside of what we would think of as reality. They're not just in our heads, is what I mean. I mean, they have an independent existence from our minds.
Okay.
They're really there.
Gotcha.
And yet they're not part of like the space-time continuum where they have shape or anything like that. And so, once I get, and again, those are two things which to me are not just my own pet view or the Christian monotheistic pet view, but it's, to me, I think most people tend to see things that way. And which probably explains why most people tend to be religious, because if you see the world in those terms, the idea of God is going to sit very nicely in that world, because you're not just thinking, oh, where did our material universe come from, and how does that get explained? Because even if you had a perfect answer for that, you still wouldn't have explained the immaterial part of the universe. It's sort of timeless, just like 2 + 2 is 4 is a timeless concept. It's the principles of logic are timeless, and so there's something timeless about this idea that there's an immaterial reality. So anyway, once I get up these stairs, I feel like we're sort of in the realm, or we're really, really, really close to what most people would think of as a religious view. And it certainly it will seem a little different to the way probably most atheists would view it, although I'm interested to see how you'll respond to these things. So then once I get there, and there's other things I could say, of course, that I could pick at certain philosophical questions and so on, but once I get there, I think for the average person, I'm like the average person, in other words. I tend to think, well, okay, so we're in a kind of religious realm, but which religion, I mean, once we get here, which of these ideas of God or which religion is going to draw my attention the most? And though I'm not claiming in my sort of like autobiographical way that I myself went through all these steps, right, to get to belief in God or belief in Jesus. I didn't do that, and I'm not claiming I did. But the next thing I think that has to be considered is which God. And again, I see, well, there's been a lot of ideas about God, but some of them are much loftier than others. The notions that some or many of the Greeks had and Romans about Zeus or Jupiter or Aphrodite or something had some. Their concept of God is that they lived up on Mount Olympus, and they really did think, many of them, that was where they lived, and they were part of the universe. They had a beginning. If you know anything about the ancient mythology stories, the theogonies, the Greek and the Roman gods came into existence, and so on. But obviously, the Israelite conception of God is, I think, completely, it's unique. It's even though there were other nations that had temples, the Jews' temple was totally different from everybody else's. For one, they only had one, and then they never had an image. They were forbidden from having an image of God. It's the only temple in the ancient world that didn't have an image of its God in it. And they had a very lofty concept of God, and that concept of God, this eternal good being, eternal being, that explains the universe, it turns out is very similar to the way Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, and so on, they thought about God, and same with the Stoics and so on later in the Roman world. So there's another aspect where it's like that concept of God, what we think of as monotheism, or at least something very, very close to monotheism, is not just a view that the Jews held, or even that the Christians held for sure, but also it turns out some really sharp thinkers in the Greek world came to that concept of God, and then also some in the Hindu world as well. There's some branches, though I don't claim to be an expert in any of that. So that's my step 3. That gets me into the Israelite religion or tradition. And then, of course, my final step is going to be the Gospels and the life of Jesus, and that's much more of a not just historical evidence, but it's I'm going to get much more into the details of his moral teachings and the record of his miracles, his resurrection, all the unique stuff about him. So anyway, I think that's about, if I were trying to simplify it to just 3 or 4 steps, I think that those are the steps I would say that I consider sort of objective evidence and a kind of pathway to that I tend to go back to a lot. That brings me into, what I'll call walls, right? Walls of security that make my intuition about that there really is a God that I have a direct impression of seem real, but there is this other objective evidence. Anyway.
Well, yeah, that's interesting the way you frame that. I think I definitely want to spend some time on the last 2 of those, as you might imagine. But I think one thing that jumped out at me and maybe some listeners was sort of the leap to which God that you made in between the first 2 and the second 2 steps. I think I know what you mean, but let me just make sure I understand. And that is, if we look at the universe, eyes wide open and see, the concept of order, and there are realities that we can't touch or feel, math, logic, those kinds of things, that we might ask the question, well, how did this all get here? And how did we get here? And that leads you to the concept of a God. Is that sort of the missing step, or am I missing something else?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair response. That once you assume the first two steps, then the questions that we are naturally going to answer, how did we get here? What explains the very nature of the universe as we know it? And so all of these kinds of, if you remember, I said back in our first, I think, conversation, I mentioned this image of if someone had cut out a tree in a backyard of a house I bought, and I didn't know that there had been a tree there, and I was digging in the yard later, a few years later, to lay a electrical line or something in it, and I came across a big root, and then 3 feet later I came across another root, and then hit another root. I would deduce from these things I keep stubbing my shovel on that a common sense explanation is that there was once a tree here at this in that yard. So I think of once these big assumptions are made, that the rest of the kind of stuff I'm going to encounter, whether it's in philosophy or science, and I'm pursuing these ultimate questions, that I think the concept of God is going to be much more readily coherent, given those other assumptions, as being a really good explanation. So things like the cosmological argument and the teleological argument in philosophy, and then questions in science like what explains fine-tuning. Well, then something like God, a timeless reality, is going to be a viable explanation. So that's why I was talking about the for a lot of people it's going to become, well, what is this timeless reality, and is that the thing that explains everything else? And
so I just want to be clear about the leap we're making, because when you talked about the concept of order, versus chaos, and you said not necessarily purpose or telos there, and then the immaterial layer of reality, not necessarily what is commonly referred to as the supernatural, or ghosts or spirits, or the spiritual realm. You're basically saying that those things do kind of lead you to ask those questions, and that's where you come up with the which God question, or the how did this all get here, or the how did we all get there, and why does it appear to be? I guess if you ask why did we go, why is this all here, and why does it appear to be ordered and sensical, for lack of a better way. Then that's right. That's what leads you to ask which God, or who did this, sort of. That's
right. It's one thing to say it is ordered, or there is an immaterial, timeless reality. Once you grant that those things are part of reality, a part of the world, then the obvious question is what explains that, and I think God becomes a really good explanation, and as part of that, but of course, then what kind of God, or what God, and so you're right. I didn't really explain that very well about how I'm getting to that third step.
So I guess I do want to get to the second two, but my first inclination was to say I'm not sure there's anything I disagree with on the first two. I obviously don't believe that there's nothing but chaos, and that there's nothing that we can understand or make sense of. I don't believe that, and I don't believe that that only material things exist. Obviously, I believe math is real, and logic, and consciousness, and other things. Mm-hmm. So none of that do I disagree with. I think it's the next steps that you take with that I'm not sure I agree with. So like the concept of purpose, just because there's order, does that mean there's purpose? I'm not sure I would concede that without, some explanation. And just because there's, immaterial realities doesn't necessarily mean that there is a spiritual realm, or that there is a creator who is sort of the cause of, and the the reason that all this exists. So I guess I did find somewhere to push back there, even though on the surface,
you did.
The way you framed them, there's really nothing to disagree with in the concepts. It's just a matter of sort of the extensions of the concepts.
Yeah, they're certainly very subtle, and obviously people disagree. So, when I think of, like, if you think of what order is another way to describe, to label that, is directedness. So if something has directedness, it's oriented toward something. Well, that's why I said it tends to go along with our normal concepts of purpose, because that's what usually we mean by purpose. We mean there's something directed about it. So there's something directed, I guess that's the only word. So that's where I'm getting that lead.
Let me push back on that a little bit, because I have to think in concrete examples when we get into these concepts. But like, let's say let's take, for just a random concept that came to mind, let's take temperature. So temperature is a concept that you would say if it's a chaotic world and there's no order, then a piece of paper might burn at room temperature sometimes, and not
correct. Yeah.
But it burns at a certain degree, Fahrenheit or Celsius, or however you want to measure it, and it doesn't otherwise. And so I consider that order, but I don't see any purpose or direction in that example.
Well, I mean, you do, because it's directed. The fact that it is predictable what it's going to do and not do means it's directed toward an end. And it's because it's directed toward an end of some kind that it allows you to not worry about, your self-combusting. By the way, when I was young, one of my absolute worst fears was that I was going to spontaneously combust, because I had seen it on some show.
I remember reading about something in the Calvin and Hobbes strip about spontaneous combustion, and he had the same fear, I think, and so I had to ask my mom what that meant. But that's great. Yeah, I mean,
educational.
I guess agree to disagree, because I understand sort of your argument that, like, if there's not chaos, then you can take something away from that. I just don't think that necessarily, maybe the piece of paper should be burned. Maybe it shouldn't be burned. Maybe I want it to be burned, and that's my purpose. Maybe I don't. But the idea of how temperature works doesn't seem to be ordered in itself to me. So,
I mean, listen, by the way, even I think I certainly, wasn't trying to make a big point about purpose. I was just trying to explain. I think for a lot of people, they tend to go hand in hand. And it's just the fact that the universe has this predictable quality to it, that things behave in a certain way and not in another. They're in that sense, I would say they're directed. And so that's where this idea that there's something directing it toward an end sort of comes in. And I mean that in the ultimate, these big philosophical questions. It's why philosophers are sort of tantalized into thinking about God, because the universe seems to have certain qualities to it. Why some philosophers, anyways, have.
Okay. Well, I don't know if that's just where the divide is, and we have different philosophies, or if one of us is just sort of patently wrong. I guess we'll just have to leave that as an open question. But I think I even said the wrong thing when I said there's not an order in it. There is. I do see an order. I don't see a purpose in some of in some of the facts about in the way that the world seems to be ordered to me. So but I don't really see anything to disagree about in the immaterial layer, because you said you're not necessarily saying that's akin to there being spiritual world. Although you would probably say that you believe that. I mean, obviously you believe that there is a spiritual world,
Right.
But it doesn't necessarily follow from the fact that there's math and logic and consciousness.
No, because I wouldn't say math is the
Right.
spiritual realm
So
per
let's
se,
leave
but it's
that-
just that the spiritual realm goes along with it. Yeah.
Yeah. You're not saying that follows. So we won't waste any time on that. So then, yeah, you get to this question of how did this all get here? Or you say, is there a God that did this, and then which God? I would say there's a lot of divide there, because the concept of making that leap. Well, we've talked about the purpose thing, and I think that's probably a large part of it, right? If you believe that there's a purpose in everything you see, it's pretty easy to say, well, I mean, it kind of goes back to Aristotle's, four ways, right? Or maybe is it ways?
Yeah,
or
5 ways, yeah.
Five,
The 5 ways, yeah.
Then one of them is the final cause, or the who made this table, or who made this world. So I can see how you would get there. So maybe the only disagreement there is really the purpose thing. So
and let me interject that I think that's actually a good, because normally we try to stay away from all this philosophical stuff, and of course neither you or I are claiming to have any expertise on these kind of things. But yes, I would say that little thing called the fifth way is more persuasive to me than just sort of the generic concept of purpose. But I do think they're closely related, and I do think there's probably a little bit of a divide there. But I don't think we need to go in too much into it, because I think I would just refer someone to the fifth way before I wanted to argue about the word purpose.
Yeah, I think we covered that in the talk about purpose, and it's a good caveat that you mentioned about we're not philosophers here. So, but so let's get on to let's allow that in your philosophy you've gotten to through the concept of purpose, you've gotten to the question, which God? I do want to just maybe ask some questions about the whole uniqueness of Israel argument perspective. I mean, I am not a scholar of any other religions, and I'm really not a scholar of even one. I used to know a good bit about Christianity. I feel like I do, but I don't really have anything to compare it to. So when you say, Israel is unique, historically speaking, I guess, is it mainly the monotheism thing that you brought out? Is that the main thrust of the uniqueness, or is there is it multifaceted?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. The definitely the idea that God, like what you might call the definition of God, or the essential characteristics of God, that God is timeless, right? That God is eternal. So this is the name Yahweh, right? Means just that. It literally is the verb is in Hebrew. So the idea that God is not a part of the temporal world we live in was not a view that hardly anyone held, other than some philosophers and some branches of Hinduism and so on. And maybe there's some Egyptians that may have held a similar concept. But for the most part, people, their views of their various gods they were very local gods. They were kind of like mascots of college football teams, and they were celebrated locally, and they saw them. If you look at all the ancient creation stories, right? The Babylonians have one called Enuma Elish, the Egyptians have theirs, the Romans have theirs, the Greeks have theirs. And when you read those creation stories, the gods all have a beginning. They have births. They come into being.
I guess the ones I'm
immortal.
most familiar with are probably like Greek and Roman mythology, right?
Yeah. Okay. And so they call them immortals because they had a beginning, but they don't have an ending.
Well, how does all the entirety, I guess, of the Old Testament, which is what I'm most familiar with when it comes to Israel's history, how does that factor into it? Because I mean, there's the overarching concept of a monotheistic, of a God that is separate from his creation, I think is what you're talking about. But then there's the nitty gritty of the Old Testament, and I guess what strikes me when I read it is that it's a very, I mean, in my reading, it seems very human, and very very flawed, and it seems like the, for my skeptical eyes, it seems like the writers are putting a lot of themselves into the concept of God that they have. So
Yeah.
we don't have to argue any of these particular points, but does your concept of the uniqueness of Israel, are there two things at work here? I'm not even asking the question very well. I guess I'm trying to get how you if it's just an innovation sort of that Israel made, as you see it, that doesn't necessarily trickle down into the details of their scriptures, or is it a wholly pervasive thing in the entire enterprise?
Yeah, I think it was wholly pervasive. So, but also definitely trickles down into their scriptures. So I would put a lot of weight, by the way, on that conception of God. Meaning, if I'm starting with the idea that there's this timeless layer of reality, timeless, then the concept of God as being timeless, that's a big
selling point.
coordination. Yeah, those things coordinate with one another very nicely. That those are two big alignments that make it very appealing. Where particularly since so many other of the religions didn't see it that way.
Okay, well,
and then they did their. Let me just say some more about that, because even before you have scriptures, you have their cultic practices, what we call cultic practices. That's just the historical term of how they did their temple, their priesthood, and all that. The way they banned people, you were banned from taking an image of the creation and using it to represent God, which of course every other nation did, right? But the Jews were banned from that because it was considered dishonoring to what God is in his essence. Now, there was more to it than just him being timeless and eternal, and eternally, he was obviously eternally powerful, but it also implied that he made the whole show. He wasn't just one God over one area, but he made everything. He made every nation. He made the whole universe. And that meant that they then saw God as caring for the whole universe, the whole of the world. So the idea, like I hear this all the time, that people try to say that Yahweh was very tribal. That the Jews were basically God's blue-eyed favorites, and then he didn't really care about anybody else. And I mean, I see that as terribly naive, and that people are just not reading these texts. That God clearly cared for the whole world right from the beginning when he made it, and all of these stories as you run through the Old Testament, there's just a lot of stories about God correcting Israel about that they themselves sometimes thought of God as only caring about them, and then there'd be a story where God says, "I want you to go to Nineveh," like he sent Jonah to Nineveh, and Jonah didn't want to go and warn the Ninevites that a judgment was coming because he feared that God would show compassion on them, and he didn't think they deserved it. He didn't like them. So, but the story is is clearly within the Israelite tradition is a story where God is reminding that nation that God cares for all the non-Jewish nations as well, and has a plan in the future for the redemption of the world, and it's not just all for them. So it wasn't just to me, it's not just this sort of, it's not merely conceptual, it's not merely the conception of God as being just timeless. It's him being eternally powerful and eternally good, eternally wise, eternally caring, and actually loving the whole world. And Israel is just one integral part of God's witness to the world, meaning they were meant to be placed in a, if you look at a map of the ancient world, right, Israel is more at the center than it would seem like it today. I know it's kind of a silly thing to say given it's a globe, but given human populations at the time, so far as we know, there was a lot of movement that went from the Far East over to the Far West, and Israel was fairly centralized. So, I see them as they saw themselves, and I think this makes sense historically, that they were planted where they were as a witness to God in the world for a witness to this unique idea of God, and they were given their revelation, scriptures, and commands about what God was like and how He expected them to live, and so on. And a lot of the things about them were just unique. It was just
all right. So obviously,
and let me add one other thing. Also, I would say to this very day, that nation remains extraordinarily unique. I know we're not supposed to add adverbs to the word unique, but it's a unique. There's to be a nation without a people for thousands of years. To be a people, a nation without a land, and to still exist, and then eventually to go back into your land. There's just something, extraordinary about that particular nation and the success they've had, and then at the same time the sort of obscene hatred and response to that nation, not just from ancient Egyptians or Babylonians, but from Christians through the Middle Ages to the Nazis to still anti-Semitism today. There's just something, I think, quite extraordinary. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, and hopefully not to alienate any Jewish listeners, I'd like to move on to your last point and say, why do you think they're wrong about Jesus?
That's good. That's a good ending, Drew.
Well, to be honest, I was gonna say, there's really, obviously I could provide a lot of counterpoints to that interpretation of Scripture, but we don't really have time to go back and forth about the Old Testament. So I do want to get to that last point because we are pretty much getting close on time, and that really was what I wanted to ask. I mean, I tried to make the transition humorously, but it really is kind of an interesting question. Is like if your admiration in some way, or of the uniqueness of Israel, of the Jewish people and their history, leads you to Jesus. Why do you think it doesn't do the same for them? For the Jewish religion and people that hold to it.
Well, I mean, in one sense, it did. It was Jews, right, who wrote these books about Jesus, largely Jews. The first Christians, of course, right, were Jews who came to this belief.
Sure. I just mean
Jesus was God.
I am being a little tongue in cheek, but I do think that it really is an interesting question because, to some extent, there are Jewish scholars and average, people that, that have considered Jesus, of course, and don't believe the same things about him that you do. So it is a point of interest, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, by the way, a point of interest right from the very beginning. You have like parts of some of the Gospels as well as the letters, like Paul's letter to the Romans, chapters 9 to 11, and certainly the Gospels, all wrestle with the question, why weren't there more Jews who came to believe that Jesus was the Messiah if he really was the Messiah? It was a question many Gentiles, by the way, asked early on in church history, is why do you expect us to believe this if most of the people in your nation don't believe this? And my answer is going to be to simply refer everybody to the actual record of the life and ministry of Jesus, and which is what the first Jewish disciples and apostles and missionaries did, is they appealed to the actual life of Jesus and what he did, and you can read the record of why some people rejected it at that time and decide whether you think it's convincing, their rejection. And my impression is that, just like to this day, not everybody, but a lot of people's reasons for why they reject the story of Jesus or or Christianity at large are sometimes not very convincing. Meaning, meaning there's a lot of angst. I'm not accusing you of this, Drew. I'm saying, you know what I mean when I say there's a lot of people who give their reasons for not believing things, and it's not very persuasive. There's angst, there's family history, there's bad experiences, there's all sorts of stuff that gets dumped out of a bucket for why people reject certain things or don't like certain things. And it's not always very cogent and well thought through. And I'm certainly not accusing the whole nation of all Jews of doing this. I'm just saying that the record of why some people believed and didn't believe is right there from the very beginning. There were obviously, again, the first converts were Jews, and most of the New Testament was written by Jews. So I believe what they did, which is that Jesus is the culmination of their religion. And though I realize that I'm not agreeing with most Israelis or most Jews today, at the same time, I see it as, but I am still agreeing with Jews who were part of the first century when Jesus actually lived and witnessed what he did and things like that. So,
yeah. Well, again, I guess that's a good. I mean, that's part of the divide in itself, is just that it's not a brute fact, I guess, that that each of these stairs leads to the next, and so the I don't want to call it a leap, but the step you're taking to get to the next one, from sort of this history of Israel step to Christianity, is a step that some make and some don't. Some see it that way, some see it a different way, and so therein lies the divide. So I guess we can.
I think that's a good summary of where we would divide on those things. Although I do think it's true that a lot of skeptics and atheists would not get even on the first stair, or if they got on the first stair, they wouldn't get on the second stair.
I think most would, just interpret those two differently, and then the last two, maybe there's even more divergence. But for the first two, I think it's just a matter of where you go, and when you take those into account. Like, do you say, as you do, that order is almost akin to purpose, and then there has to be some mind behind all of these things, and that gets you right on to the direction that you move. So it's interesting because I thought that there was going to be pretty much no disagreement, and I think there is pretty much no disagreement in the two concepts. I think the disagreement comes in the interpretation of the concepts.
Yeah. And even I would say with you that, like when you get to like, is there a mind or not? Even I would say, that it's not like I think you can, it's not it has to be, it has to be this, it leads you inexorably to this. It's more like, well, to me, it works a lot better to conclude that there is a mind that explains this other stuff. And then once I do that, then I feel like other stuff starts to fit into place as well. But no surprise. But that's the divide. And I think, I think it's more. I guess what I would say is I find it a lot more problematic to not follow the steps. But of course, that's where the divide is going to be. And I think your last question is also a really good one. Just even if you got to believing, like I think it was Antony Flew. That was an atheist philosopher in Britain for like 50 years. He was really famous in the late 20th century. And then toward the end of his life, he became a theist. He didn't become a Christian. He said he believed in, I think, Aristotle's God or whatever. He gave up atheism. In other words, he went up like the first two stairs, but he didn't agree on, my third and fourth stairs or whatever. So, all right. Well, I think very interesting conversation. I hope people have enjoyed it. And I look forward, Drew, to hearing the best evidence you have to support your position in our final cross-examination series in our next interview. So I'm Bill the Christian.
Well, and before we sign off, maybe we should remind people that we have our Reddit page that they can go jump into the discussion with us.
Yes, thanks
so
for putting that.
You're better with Reddit than I am, so do you want to give the address? Unless I have the page pulled up, I don't know how to do that.
It's just the divide. You just go to Reddit and you type in the divide by iPub.
The Divide by iPub, IPUB. Okay, great. Well, I will have to get my thoughts together for the next part of this, but until then, I guess we can close it out.
Sounds good. I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic. Thanks for listening.
The Divide is produced by Alan and Ben Hawbrooks and edited by John Workman. Dalton Reed handles IT. Join us for further discussion on this topic at our subreddit, TheDividebyiPUB. To learn more about other episodes and who we are, check out ipub.org/thedivide. See you next time on The Divide.